Okay, so today I want to have a discussion about everybody's favorite fighting game term. I'm sure if you watch your favorite players stream, you've probably heard them throw this one around a lot, and that is the concept of risk reward. This is something that it honestly is a part of like every facet of fighting games. Whenever it comes to strategy development, whether you're trying to just figure out your own play style, figure out how to play your character, or trying to develop matchup strategies, almost everything comes back to risk reward assessment. It's one of the most involved things in fighting games, I think. And while I think the term is like somewhat self-explanatory, you know, like risk reward, you know, it kind of says it in the name, right? I think a lot of the times people don't fully understand what it actually means, and much less how to actually assess it and how to look into it and make your own decisions based on risk reward. So what I want to talk about is just kind of talk about what risk reward actually is, you know, like how do we define it? I want to talk about the process of being able to break situations down via risk reward. I think that's very important, and just kind of give my opinions on the topic a little bit. So like I said, risk reward is pretty self-explanatory, right? It's how much reward do you get when your decision is correct, right? What do you get? How much damage is it? Do you get a good knockdown? That type of thing. And then on the flip side, what does your opponent get if you're wrong, right? What is their damage? What is their knockdown? That type of thing. And the reason why this is so important is because pretty much every decision in a fighting game can lead to somebody taking a damage, right? Everything you do in a fighting game is with the purpose of either not getting hit yourself or hitting the opponent. When it comes to actually assessing risk reward though, I think this is when things get a lot harder to start managing and start thinking about. So just for like a extreme example, think about something like a wake up DP, right? If you do a wake up DP, your reward is that you got your opponent off of you and you got the ability to go back to either neutral or maybe you got some offense, depends on the character, depends on the game. And then on the flip side, if your DP gets baited, if they block it or if it whiffs or whatever, you'll probably explode, usually, right? And that's kind of like an extreme case of managing risk reward. You know, those parallels are kind of obvious, I think, or those differences are kind of obvious, I think. But when it comes to managing risk reward for like neutral interactions and whatnot, I think that's when things get a lot harder to manage, because the thing about fighting games is that right now, when you're playing neutral, technically your entire moveset can be used, right? Any move you want to use, any normal, any special move, whatever it is, you have access to all of them. And an interesting thing about fighting games is that it's not just about deciding what moves you want to use, it's about figuring out why you don't want to use other moves. And a way you can go about doing that is looking into risk reward. So I actually want to take a situation with Ram versus Sol, and we can kind of like break it down and talk about how risk reward works with them. So let's just take a neutral situation where as the Ram player, you're wanting to use something like a dash up 2K. If you're wanting to assess the risk reward of the situation, assessing the reward is the easiest part because it's just what can your character do, right? As Ram, what do I get when I hit somebody with 2K? Generally speaking, you'll probably get 2K 2D, that almost always combos. On counter hit, you can also do stuff like 2K into Rekka. The only time this won't combo is if they're like too far away or something, but that's pretty rare nowadays. So generally, her reward is actually pretty good, and that's like the easy part because it's just assessing your own character and the damage that they can do. But the actually difficult part is assessing the opponent's options. And another aspect of risk reward that I really want to bring attention to, because I feel like this often either gets overlooked or people just don't give it enough attention, even though I think it is different enough from just the raw numbers of risk reward, is what I refer to as odds. What I mean by odds is the odds of a tool working and the odds of somebody picking a tool, because those are two very important things and matter a lot when it comes to risk reward. So we're going to talk about that while we're breaking this down. So if you're a Sol bad guy in the situation and you're wanting to deal with Ram, do something like dash 2K. Again, fighting games are tricky because you can use your entire moveset. And with that in mind, you can even beat Ram's 2K with your entire moveset. It just depends on the timing of things and the spacing of things. So it's not a matter of what can you work, it's a matter of deciding what are the best options to use in that situation. Let's take something like Sol's 6S as example. This is his farthest reaching normal and neutral, and it's pretty rewarding on hits, especially counter hit. If you counter hit somebody with 6S, you get a full-on wombo combo, whatever you want. However, while the option has a lot of range and a lot of damage, it's not actually that likely to work because against Ram's 2K, Sol's 6S has decent amount of startup and it has an extended hurt box around his feet. So against the option like Ramps 2K, even though 6S technically outranges it, it's not likely to work because of hurtbox interactions, and it's not likely to work because of the speed of the normal. It's slower, right? That's why looking at the odds of things is very important for stuff like this, and you can't just look at the raw damage numbers. Damage-wise, Soul 6S out rewards Rams 2K. So let's take like another option from Soul. You have something like his 6H. His 6H is much faster than 6S. It's a very, very fast button. Also very rewarding on counter hit. However, this button also, well, it actually has decent odds of working because it is so fast and relatively disjointed. You aren't going to see people use it very much. So this is the odds of them using it being low, because all you have to do is either make the move whiff or just block it and you get a guaranteed punish. Whatever you want to do will punish this move. While the move is rewarding and it's fast, it's very risky to throw out because it loses to very common things such as being out of range or just blocking. So already with 6S, we have an option that's like decently rewarding, and it's not the worst in terms of odds of working, but it's not that great. You have something like 6H, which has high odds of working, but also if they just block or something, it's very unsafe. So it's not really worth doing. And as the RAM player, it's not really worth considering because no one's really going to pick it because of how much risk is behind it. Let's talk about something like Souls 2S instead. Souls 2S is kind of like the best of both worlds. It's pretty fast startup. It doesn't have that much recovery, so you don't have to worry about getting whiff punished as much, and it doesn't have the issue of having like an extended hurt box or something, so you're a lot less likely to get stuffed in your startup by Rams 2K in this situation. It's also pretty rewarding because you get like a full conversion on counter hit, even non-counter hit, you at least get Bandit Revolver into a knockdown. So this is kind of how the process goes. You want to look into like whatever it is you're trying to beat. Again, in neutral, it's the hardest thing to kind of assess because there's so many different tools you can use. But you want to picture whatever it is, whatever move that you're trying to beat, and then you want to look through your moves and assess the reward attached to them, the risk that you're taking, as in like how much reward would your opponent get for hitting you out of that move. You also want to consider the odds of that move working, right? Because if you're using like a really slow move or a move without a lot of range, they're less likely to work in situations. The other thing that gets tricky about risk reward is that you can't just look at it in a vacuum. You can't just look at it as one button. So let's say as Ram, we start taking her 6P into account as well. If we take 6P into account, going back to Soul 6S, his 6S gets even worse because Ram 6P is a common option she'll represent, so high odds of being used, and it does very well against Soul 6S because her hurt box is invulnerable on the top half of her character. So if Soul does something like 6S, whenever you 6P, it basically just can't hit you. And because of the hurt box being so big, you'll pretty much always counter hit him out of it. So something like 2S gets even weaker because another common option is going to beat it. So risk reward is even more skewed against Soul in that regard. However, his 2S gets even better because his 2S beats 6P and it doesn't really ever lose. There really isn't a situation where you can 6P Soul out of 2S. So his 2S, which is already pretty good, is even better. So the thing that gets tricky about risk reward is you have to keep in mind not just the very specific normal or situation you're thinking about, you have to think about how the other options feed into what you're thinking of. That is the simplest way I could explain the thought process behind assessing risk reward. And like I said, every decision in fighting games involves this. Like almost everything you do, whether it's offense, whether it's defense, everything involves some amount of reward and some amount of risk. And in many cases, you don't want to just think about the damage involved in something. You want to think about the knockdown. Do you get a good knockdown from it? In the case of something like Ram, again, she gets, you know, a full conversion into her Rekka series, which is a hard knockdown, which is very good for her. You also want to think about the meter game. You want to think about the corner carry that the opponent gets. All of those things are a part of reward, and it's something you want to keep in mind. Even something like blocking carries risk in a situation. If Soul was just like, okay, I'm going to block it out here, right? He just wants to take a relatively safe decision because you can't really get hit for blocking here. He still runs the risk of you pushing him more towards the corner, right? You're getting space for it. Ram's building meter off of this. She's also building Soul's risk gauge. a lot of times you can't just look at the raw damage. You got to think about the other aspects of the fighting game when it comes to risk reward as well. I think too, when it comes to risk reward, there's kind of like two different types of moves they can kind of categorize. There's usually like low risk, low reward moves, and usually in Guilty Gear, these are going to be stuff like P normals and K normals. Some characters are exceptions to this. Like I was just talking about, Ram's 2K is actually really rewarding. A lot of other characters, not so much. Their 2Ks don't lead to as much as Ram's. These buttons are really nice because they don't have a lot of risk to them. You'll notice for a lot of strong players in fighting games, they really value what is also often referred to as consistency. And usually what that refers to is just this option. It might not be the most rewarding, but it's not likely to lose, right? Going back to what I was saying about odds, things that are not likely to lose are very good in fighting games. No matter what the reward attached to them is, the fact that you can choose an option that is just generally going to be safe in the situation is very nice to have. So again, that's going to be like your P's or K's. Some cases, some characters /slashes maybe. And then you have options that are like either medium reward, medium risk, or like high risk, high reward. An extreme of that would be something like Soul's Success, because it is very high reward on counter hit, but also very high risk if it's blocked or if it whiffs or whatever. These options are not inherently bad, because when you look at these options, sometimes depending on the situation of the game, it's actually reasonable to bank on like a big hit. Sometimes you have to. Sometimes if the matchup is maybe bad for your character, sometimes you have to bank on like bigger hits. There's also moves that kind of fall like a little bit in between. So like Soul's Success is not the most dangerous move. It's not that risky to throw out, but it's also not the safest move, but it's still pretty rewarding. So when you're looking at your character's options, you want to kind of think about your moves like that. Like, what is the lower risk options? What are the medium risk? And what are the high risk options? You probably will want to steer away from the high risk ones most of the time. Medium risk ones are usually worth throwing in there because of the reward behind them. It's just about moderation and knowing when to use them. And then a lot of your game plan is going to be based around the lower risk options, stuff like your 2Ks. In the case of Soul, his /slash is pretty low risk because it has low whiff recovery and still pretty high reward. You feel like you have trouble understanding risk reward on defense? Defense gets a little bit tricky because, you know, obviously the deck is like stacked against you in this situation because your opponent's at advantage. So managing a risk reward on defense is often like, usually you want to represent a lot of low risk options. In the case of Guilty Gear, this would be using things like FD. Even though FD isn't an attack, there is still risk reward attached to using it. You know, if you're just FDing a bunch and Soul just ends up doing a bunch of close slashes or whatever, you're just going to end up wasting meter. So you want to try to rely on a lot of low risk stuff like FDing, blocking, doing stuff like jumps, like up back in the corner, fuzzy jumping, trying to jump out of the corner, like low risk things like that. But sometimes, especially in a game like Guilty Gear, sometimes you just have to kind of like, funnily enough, not worry about the concept of risk reward too much and just go with something. Sometimes you just gotta pick an option and go with it. And when it comes to those situations, you want to focus on the reward more so, because you want to make sure that if you're doing something on defense, that it's going to get you somewhere. A very common thing I see with a lot of people is they'll be on defense, they'll be blocking it out, and then they'll finally mash, but they won't mash into like a conversion. They'll just like press a button and do nothing. If you're doing that, the risk reward is really bad, right? Because you're taking a big risk mashing on defense. But if you're not converting that mash into a knockdown, then it's not even really worth the risk anymore. Of course, sometimes when you mash, you might not be able to, and that's fine. That's just how it goes. But there are many times where people are able to, and they just don't do it. And you're making risk reward in that situation so much worse for you for doing that. Same thing can apply to offense too. Like if you're running offense on somebody, it's about minimizing the risk you're taking. Like you want to very often give your opponent less chances to do things, which, you know, inherently translates to less risky. You don't really have to worry about reward because you're already winning, right? You're already at advantage, you're already pressuring them. And it's kind of more on the opponent to make choices in these situations. The mindset between offense and defense are a bit different. And I think it's also good to just keep in mind, like if you're defending, think about how the attacker is thinking about the situation and try to like think about it from their perspective. It might make you better at making decisions on defense and vice versa. If you're on offense, think about how the defender might be thinking, and that will help you gauge your decisions better. There's just a lot of options to consider in neutral. And I think a lot of times in fighting games, players tend to overwhelm themselves thinking about all the things they can do, because in fighting games you can do a lot of things pretty much at any point in the match. So the important thing is being able to break down what options are good to use, what options that you want to use, and pretty much the fastest and most efficient way to figure that out is understanding risk reward. This is not a process that is done overnight. This is something that you do all throughout your time playing fighting games. Even when you think you have it figured out in a matchup, I promise you a month later you'll be like, you know what, I think this situation's a little bit different than I thought, now that I'm reevaluating risk reward. So don't feel like risk reward is something that you ever solve. It's more just a constant in fighting games that you always want to keep in mind. At the end of the day, this is a pretty complex topic, so if you have any questions that you want to ask, go ahead and drop it in the comments. I love helping people and I like talking about this stuff, so don't feel afraid to ask anything in the comments. Also, please consider dropping a like. It would really help me out. And if you can, subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. I have a lot more on the way. Definitely do not want to miss out on those. But I think that's gonna do it for this one, guys. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.